Our first speaker this morning is Chris Urmson, the director of the self-driving cars projects at Google. Chris was a member of the Carnegie Mellon team that won the 2007 DARPA Grand Urban Challenge. Something big happened to Chris earlier this year. He received a letter from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration letting him know that as far as the agency was concerned, Google was now a driver. Google's autonomous car now was, as far as they were concerned, a driver, and that they would be held at fault if there was an accident. So, on that note, Chris, join us on stage and tell us how the project is going. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I guess I'm Chris Urmson. I lead the technical work at Google on self-driving cars, and I guess I'm now the proud parent of a driver, along with my two boys. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the history. I'll dive into a little bit about the Urban Challenge and Grand Challenge for a couple minutes, a little bit about the technology, and a little bit about what to expect. But before I jump into that, if it's possible to get my slides to advance. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. I get a chance to come and talk to people like this, but it takes an army to actually move this technology forward, and I wouldn't be able to talk to you about it without these incredible people that do the work back home on the project. So what I'm showing you today is really their work more than mine. So for me, though, this story started in a desert, in the Atacama Desert in Chile. I was down there on a NASA project with the team from Carnegie Mellon exploring the desert with a robot that went about this fast. And in fact, it was so slow that kind of the buzzards would fly off the hills nearby, circle overhead, assuming whatever was moving that slowly was going to die. They got really disappointed by about day 3. And my advisor flew down to check out how the project was going and said, "Hey, Chris, I heard about this DARPA challenge. We're going to have robots that are going to drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas across the desert, hitting 50 miles an hour." And having spent a couple of weeks chasing a robot moving like this, that sounded awesome. So I said, I'm in. And we pulled together a bunch of graduate students, and in about 6 months, we took a Humvee apart and kind of made it into a robot and did this to it. Notably, the black things are supposed to be down. We were testing the first time we tried to get it to 150 miles, came around a corner, tripped over itself, did that to it. We got it put back together. We put it into the Grand Challenge. It was the robot that went that 7.5 miles of the 150 miles and then got high centered on a berm. It seemed like a disaster to us at the time, but when we looked at kind of the product of speed and distance, it was about an order of magnitude more than anyone had done before. And so we were excited about that, and despite the press kind of crucifying everyone involved, DARPA said, come back in a year and a half and let's see what happens then. And so we did. And we brought a second vehicle, and again, about 10 days before the competition, we parked it on its roof. We got it back together. This is the wonder of having graduate students. Entered in the competition, and as Jason said, 5 of those vehicles, including our 2, finished the competition that day. Unfortunately for us, the guys from Stanford also entered, and they won the competition, and their vehicle's now in the Smithsonian. This was really because it was such a monumental day for the whole field. We got a thank you. They got the $1 million check in the Smithsonian. But the Defense Department said, okay, that's great. You can drive across the desert without hitting too many things. Now let's get them to be kind of driving on their side of the road, and let's get them to park and be able to move around bases. And so they came up with the Urban Challenge in 2007. And the idea here was drive 60 miles around this base, don't bump into anything, obey traffic laws, at least at stop signs, and kind of stay out of the way of the other traffic. And in this video, you're seeing from the vehicle that I was working on, you can see the cars with stuff on the roof, those are the other robots, and the cars that are breaking the rules are the traffic drivers that they hired to follow vehicles around and generate traffic that day. And if you squinted just right, you would think, wow, we've solved the problem, right? This car, 60 miles later, had driven around, came back, and actually finished that challenge. And that year, we actually had 6 teams finish it. And we kind of got up on our soapboxes and said, self-driving cars are coming. They're going to be here. We can go make something happen in the world. And we were really excited about it. And the Defense Department said, you're right, they're here. Problem solved. Go figure it out yourselves. We're not funding it anymore because somebody else should pick up the tab now. And so it ended up getting a little quiet in the space for a couple of years. And then in 2009, we started a program at Google to move this technology kind of from the laboratory out into the world and try and do something good with it. And so this is my team's mission. It's to improve people's lives by transforming mobility. And it sounds a little corporate, but this is what it means. First, there's a huge segment of the population that doesn't get the privilege of driving. So this is Steve Mann. He's blind, it turns out. Incredibly capable guy, but instead of a half-hour commute every day, he has a 2-hour commute because he has to piece together bits of public transit. And so for someone like Steve, there is no other really good option to get around in life. He doesn't have the same privileges we all have. Safety is another huge impact. So in the US, 35,000 people were killed on the roads last year. 1.2 million people were killed worldwide. Those are big numbers, and so it's hard to really understand them. 35,000 people is more than a 737 crashing every workday, 5 times a week. We wouldn't accept that in public transit. Why, or in air transit? Why would we accept that on our roads? We can definitely do better, particularly since the large cause of those crashes is human error. Congestion is a disaster. We have more car miles traveled and not as much road, and it has a huge toll on people. So it turns out if you look at how many lives we basically waste in traffic every day, it's 162 people. Just their time is kind of spent just getting to and from work every day. So when I say transforming mobility, this is what we're talking about, this whole raft of activities. So we've been at it at Google for the last 7 years, and the program's really had 3 phases. The first phase was trying to prove to ourselves that the technology could actually be commercialized. We came to the company not with the idea of kind of publishing research papers, but with moving it forward to a product. And we weren't we weren't convinced that it could actually happen. Then we started spending some time moving into making vehicles that could drive on freeways. And then over the last few years, we've been really trying to make cars that could drive everywhere. To prove to ourselves the technology could really work, we set 2 goals. One was to drive 100,000 miles on public roads, and that was 10 times more than anyone had ever done before. And the other was to pick a bunch of really interesting places to drive. One kind of gave us statistical data, and the other allowed us to understand the whole breadth of the problem. Within about 2 years, we were able to pull these challenges off, and we were able to convince ourselves that yes, this technology actually could work. It's not ready yet, but there's a path to actually seeing it in the world. And so we turned to what we thought would be our first product. And that was a vehicle that you could get into, put it on the freeway, press a button, and it would drive down the lane for you. And then when you got near your exit, it would tell you have to take over and drive. And this was, for us, really condensing the scope and making it as simple as possible. And we thought that would be a wonderful product. And so we worked on that for 2 years. And we got to the point where we were pretty sure it was ready to go. And we sent out an email to Google, and we said, hey, anyone want to come try a self-driving car? We'll let you borrow it for a while. You just need to tell us about the experience. And so within about 24 hours, we had 4,000 responses. It is Google. And of that, we picked 140 people that got to use the cars in their daily lives. And we looked at what they were doing in the vehicle, and we had them come in and tell us how they felt about it and how they used it. And so we had people like this one guy drives a Porsche. He comes in the first day and says, this whole thing is stupid, right? I like driving. I own a Porsche. I'm only doing this because I like gadgets. And then he had it for a week, and he came back, and he said, you can't have it back. Turns out I'm a terrible driver. All those other people are terrible drivers. This thing is magical, right? And so we thought we were onto something because we got universally that this was a wonderful feature. And then we looked at what they were doing in the car. And we told them, look, you work for Google. We know who you are. You're representing the product. We're going to be keeping an eye on you. And by the way, this is a prototype, right? We've tested it pretty well, but it's going to break. And you need to be there when it isn't. You need to pay attention the whole time. And we showed them it breaking, and then we let them try it. And what we found was that these people very, very quickly believed in the technology and accepted that it was going to work, because it really did almost all the time. To the point that we had one guy in the car who thought it'd be really funny for other drivers on the freeway to think there was no driver. So, he sat there in the seat and he, lowers it all the way back on the freeway, right? And we had another guy in there who notices the cell phone battery is low, so he, checks, pulls out his laptop from the back, pulls out the charging cable, plugs the two in, and then looks out the window at 65 miles an hour on the freeway. And we said, this is not good. And we have a choice now. There's three paths, right? So one is, launch it and see. The next is let's electroshock them or shake the seat or something to make sure that they're paying attention. And the third was let the customer do what they want to do, right? Which is not pay attention to driving. And we picked the last avenue. And we realized it was going to be really hard. So this is an intersection I bike through on my way to work every day. If you contrast it to the slide before on the freeway, first, traffic's going every which direction. There's traffic lights, there's railway crossings, there's pedestrian crossings, there's cyclists, there's pedestrians, and then you have road engineers who do this to the road. It turns out cars don't drive like that. They need curves. And yet you still have to drive in those situations. And so that's what we've been doing for the last few years. And in pushing this idea of a vehicle that drives you rather than having to drive a vehicle, we wanted to understand what should that vehicle look like. And so we designed a vehicle from the ground up to be safe for self-driving and to kind of be a vehicle that drives you. And if it drives you, there's things you don't need, like steering wheels and brake pedals and gas pedals. Because if the steering wheel is there, there's kind of an implicit contract. You're going to do something with it. So let's get that confusion out of the way. And of course, the vehicle needs an incredible amount of sensing to understand the world around it and see what's going on. So we combine laser, radar, and camera data to do that. And this is what it looks like. So we have short-range lasers that allow the car to see in close. We have mid-range lasers that allow the car to understand the situation around it. And then it can peer with very high resolution where it needs to, out to a couple of 100 meters, and look down the road and give it all the situational awareness it needs. And so this is how the software kind of works, is it starts with the car understanding roughly where it is. We layer in this map, and then the laser data that allows it to kind of see the shape of things around it. Now from the laser data, we need to extract what's going on in the scene and classify it. So here we start by understanding that's a cyclist, there's some cars and cones and a pedestrian in front of us. But that's not really enough, because it turns out, if you look at this scene, that's actually a police officer with his door open, pulling the car over. And so the car actually adds semantic understanding of the door being open, that is a stopped vehicle, and the vehicle in front of it are a stopped police car, and that's a parked vehicle in front of it. And now it knows pretty much everything it needs to know in the moment, and then it just needs to think what's going to happen in the future. And it needs to do that for all the actors in the scene, and it does this 10 to 20 times per second. So now that it knows what's going on in the world, it can start to figure out what's it going to do about it. And so in this case, that trajectory that rolls out from the little bubble car there is the path we're going to take. So how do we do that? We do it first through learning and sharing information. So when one car drives through a scene, the next car through can understand that the lane to the right, say, has construction in it. But much more interesting than that, we've actually seen thousands and thousands of vehicles, and we've seen thousands and thousands of pedestrians. And so we can use that information to understand where those objects are in the world and extract them from the background. And then even more interesting than that, we know how they move because we've seen pedestrians in crosswalks. And so we can predict where they're going to go. And we've seen cyclists going down the side of the road. We know they nudge out for other cars. We see cyclists come the wrong way down the road. We know they continue to do so. We can tell the difference between someone making a turn and the very subtle cues that mean someone's about to make a U-turn, and then we can yield for them appropriately. We've done a lot of driving in urban environments, so we've seen kids run out and chase balls. We've dealt with big trucks on narrow roads where the car has to pull to the side to avoid traffic. And of course, we every once in a while have a self-driving car encounter a self-driving car and have to pull over. Here we see people pushing the car out of the road. In this case, we have to be a good road user, share the road with the cyclists who see ahead that the road is congested or the bike lane is congested, make space for them to pull over, and every once in a while we have somebody going to come out and mess with our car too. And of course, we have to deal with big buses on the road. Now, that's kind of a lot of normal situations. I'm going to walk you through fairly quickly one of the scarier situations we've encountered. So here we're coming up to an intersection, and watch the vehicle or the cyclist coming out from the right here. Yeah. Now, turns out I've watched this video a lot, and I'm fairly convinced if I were driving, I would have clobbered that cyclist. But let me tell you what the car saw. So first, it saw the cyclist on the left, and it predicted the cyclist was going to continue weaving in front of us. So this is where, as a human driver, all your attention is spent. And then suddenly, instantly, the cyclist comes around the corner, and we see that cyclist and start reacting to it. What's really cool, and I didn't see even after the first kind of half dozen times I watched this video, is the car also sees the pedestrian in the crosswalk to the left, and the car crossing the road behind it, and the pedestrian stood at the intersection, and it's reasoning about all of those things simultaneously. So how do we get this to work? Well, we do a lot of testing in closed courses that give this vehicle really challenging situations to deal with. But we can't anticipate everything. We have to kind of generalize the understanding. And this is a scene that happened in Mountain View. Car comes around a corner. There's a woman in a wheelchair chasing a duck. Yeah. So we've read the DMV handbook. It doesn't say anything about it. We had crazy people thinking about crazy ideas, didn't come up. But the car has to understand, kind of generalize that this is something it doesn't know what's going to happen, so just kind of let that play out. And we've seen weirder things. This is people playing Frogger in the road for real. I don't know where that comes from. These are 3 cars going the wrong way down the road in Austin, Texas. 1, 2, and then wait for the third one here. There he is, trying to catch up. We had this happen. I don't even know what to describe this as. Drunk guy on the hood. And this is actually possibly my favorite. This guy was so excited to see our cars, he forgot to put on his pants. And then ran out to show us. So we see all kinds of bizarre things. High level of entertainment for all. And so the biggest question I get is how quickly is this going to kind of come to market? We've seen all kinds of crazy things. And the short answer is it's going to come in phases. And we're going to see it coming into kind of urban areas first, where we can kind of understand what the weather is and what the traffic's like. And then over time, we're going to see broader and broader adoption. It's going to take a while because the U.S. vehicle fleet takes about 15 years to turn over. But the technology's coming, and my goal is to have it on the road before my son has to get a driver's license. And with all your help, I think we can actually get there. So thank you very much.
How old is your son, Chris?
So my son is 12, my older son. So, yeah, time is ticking.
But, so, at the soonest, in certain constrained circumstances, like cities, just a few years, what are the really difficult constrained environments, unconstrained environments, forgive me, where it will take 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I don't think any of it will take 20, 30 years. I think that the technology is really advancing very rapidly, but I think the hardest thing is when you start to get into both very dense traffic, so where people kind of have to be aggressive to make progress. We're trying to build these vehicles to be safe, and that means in general they're a little less aggressive than human drivers are. And then the other is dealing with kind of very challenging weather conditions. So, people have a hard time driving in monsoon rain. We probably don't need the cars to drive in monsoon rain, so, we might push that out a long way.
So Boston will take a while,
yep.
And Cairo. Yeah. Okay. So you're focused on what the industry calls level 4, which is full autonomy, but you've now done, I think, 1.5 million miles on the road, and the accidents you've had so far suggest that the biggest cause of accidents is human error. So, given that you can't flip a switch and get, all the fleet automatic at once, how are you going to exist around the constraints of human error?
Well, I think the biggest challenge with driving on the roads is dealing with the other people there, and as we've seen, the vast majority of the accidents our vehicles have been involved in have just been people not really paying attention. These are accidents that would never get reported otherwise. So, for example, I think the highest energy accident we've had, our vehicle was following two vehicles. The first vehicle stops at a green light to not block the box and does a nice gentle deceleration. The car behind him does a nice gentle deceleration to a stop. Our vehicle does a nice gentle deceleration to a stop, and the car behind us doesn't even hit the brakes. And pretty clearly that they were not looking out the window. And so what we really need to move the conversation from is bumping into vehicles, because we don't really have a good baseline for people. Yeah. None of the accidents that our vehicle has been involved in would have been reported if they were being reported at the same standard that people have to. So it's kind of getting folks to understand that as people, we don't do that great a job of actually driving.
Are you suggesting that autonomous vehicles are being held to a higher standard than human drivers, and does that disturb you?
Well, I think that we're reporting to a higher standard than human drivers are, and I think the aspiration is to be at a much higher standard than human driving, and that's really why we're engaged in this technology. It's not going to get drunk, it's not going to get distracted, it doesn't respond to a text message when it's driving. It's always looking around it, and so we should go above and beyond what humans can do.
So in a moment we're going to hear from Ryan Shin of Optimus Ride, who's done much of his work in cities like Singapore, which has the opportunity to fundamentally change the driven environment. But in places like California, what can be done in the short term to make the roads better and more usable for driverless cars?
Yeah. So I guess our philosophical approach has been don't. Do for the roads what you would do for human drivers. So, people will drive better with better lane markings. People will drive better with better signage and with the hedges moved back. But we really need the technology to work with the infrastructure that's out there today, because cities don't have money to put into it, states don't have money, the federal government doesn't have money to put into it. Over time, as the technology gets deployed and we start to realize all these social advantages that we think will be there, then we can talk about optimizing and doing interesting things with traffic lights and dedicated lanes. But for now, it really has to work with the world as it is.
What does the NHTSA decision mean for Google in terms of regulatory oversight and in terms of liability?
So what NHTSA's done is and DOT and Secretary Fox more broadly have recognized the importance of this technology and what it means to the American public, what it's going to mean more broadly, kind of to have that technological advantage and for American industry. And so what's great is to see them moving to try and have kind of federal level guidelines that will give the states and cities input that will allow them to kind of craft policies that are at least as close to consistent as possible across the country. Because the worst thing that could happen for us is 50 different rules about what a self-driving car is or isn't, and you have your self-driving car in California and you go to Utah and you need to put different plates on it or something. That'd just be goofy.
But that mess does kind of exist, because at the same time the Californian DMV has said that there needs to be a passenger in the car under all circumstances at least for testing purposes.
Yeah, so they've said that for testing, and this isn't, really that big a deal for us. When we test our vehicles, we test them with people in them because by definition we expect them to brake. It's a test. Yeah. And so it's not that big a hit. I think over time, though, it's pretty clear that the benefit of a self-driven vehicle is not having someone drive it. And so that's where we think that there may be a little bit of a philosophical difference.
Chris, I'll have you back on stage in a sec. Thank you very much.
Thank you.